Hello, my name is Chad Reese. I am the Director of Planning for the Southeast Tennessee Development District located in Chattanooga, Tennessee. We are a regional council of governments serving a number of communities throughout our region and are run by the city and county mayors. And as one of the services that we offer to our communities are local planning assistance services, where we contract with 25 communities currently to provide professional planning services to their planning commissions. One of the topics we consistently get requests about to have more information on are tiny homes. And so that's a topic I was hoping to cover with you today, share some experiences that we've had throughout our region and talk about how tiny homes might fit into your community. Tiny homes have become a new phenomenon in recent years, with younger generations looking to own their own place without going into debt or locking themselves into a 30-plus year mortgage. The popularity of living small has grown in part due to television shows like Tiny House Big Living, Tiny House Hunters, Tiny House Nation, and others from television networks like HGTV and DIY. This style of living is being promoted as a less expensive, more eco-friendly, and energy-efficient way to live. It has the advantage of allowing individuals to move into areas with higher cost of living while reducing housing costs, living expenses, and having the ability to place their home on a much smaller parcel of land. On the other hand, for those who enjoy a more transient lifestyle, it is easier to pack up and move to another city. Because who needs a moving van when you can take your entire house with you? But in all seriousness, when you hear the word tiny home these days, this is what you probably envision. Or maybe something a little more rustic looking like this. The construction and variety of tiny homes has come a long way in just a few short years, and they are now more contemporary and modern, offering many of the luxuries and amenities of a typical home, only in a smaller size. The picture in the upper left and middle center are of a new tiny home called the Salt Box, now offered by Clayton Mobile Homes. A few quick clicks on Amazon and you can even buy your own tiny house kit complete with construction materials. IKEA even has their own version, though some assembly may be required. Tiny homes also now come in a more industrial looking variety, with designers repurposing old shipping containers. These are a few examples where repurposed containers have been converted into single-family dwellings that incorporate a modern design into an otherwise mundane-looking shell. But then again, there are still those outliers pushing the boundaries of modern contemporary living. Sometimes visions going from what you see in the picture here to, well, maybe not the best curb appeal, but the inside is quite impressive. Yet still you will run across those oddities and uniquely styled tiny homes that will leave you scratching your head just wondering, what were these people thinking? Tiny homes are no longer just for the young or the transient couple looking to travel the country. Many have started envisioning them as being an extension of their homes where they can provide space for their aging parents to live nearby or even in their backyards. Like these examples, tiny homes do not always come in the form of a trailer-mounted structure. Many are often built on-site with a permanent foundation. With our senior population continuing to grow, granny flats, as they are known, may become a more financially viable solution compared to expensive nursing homes or leaving our seniors in large single-family homes by themselves. Regardless of your position on tiny homes overall, this is an area where local governments might want to take a serious look at allowing special provisions in their zoning ordinances to allow temporary accessory dwellings for our seniors. If granted by a temporary permit that requires renewal each year, this would enable our seniors to live closer to their loved ones who can provide the necessary care and a watchful eye over them. It will also allow our seniors to downsize from their much larger homes, enabling those homes to be put back on the market for other families seeking an affordable place to live. Planners around the country have begun to reevaluate their zoning ordinances to allow tiny homes in more places, making affordable housing and home ownership more of a possibility for low-income individuals and families. Many churches and cities have also begun looking into tiny homes as a low-cost option for housing for their growing homeless populations. In 2018, Seattle, Washington partnered with the Low Income Housing Institute to build 10 tiny home villages. Each village contained between 15 to 34 tiny homes and occupies between 6,000 to 30,000 square feet of land. The villages serve anywhere from 20 to 70 people, can be constructed in as little as 6 months, and have a construction cost of between $100,000 and $500,000, most of which were the added cost for water, sewer, and electrical connections. In Michigan, Community Social Services focused on fighting poverty by purchasing a 2-block stretch in Detroit for the construction of 240 to 400 square foot micro dwellings that were set up on a rent-to-own model for the low-income population, which included students, seniors, and those who were formerly homeless. In Syracuse, New York, nonprofit A Tiny Home for Good focused on building 300 square foot homes for their homeless veteran population. Units cost around $28,500 and were mostly built with volunteer labor and donated supplies. Here a little closer to home, an interfaith group called Infinity Fellowship in Nashville, Tennessee, partnered with a construction company from Memphis to build 6 colorful 60 square foot shelters for the homeless on property of the Green Street Church of Christ. The cost of the development was $50,000, which is mostly raised on a GoFundMe page. The city later gave a $120,000 gift to the group to continue this project. Here is one final example from Nashville, which resulted in a lawsuit and Tennessee's first ever challenge to the zoning under the Religious Freedom Act. Glencliff United Methodist Church is located on a 5.97 acre parcel of land on Glencliff Road in Nashville. It is bordered by Interstate 24 and Thompson Lane and was zoned RS10, which is a residential single family with a 10,000 square foot minimum lot size. The church sought to use part of this property to construct a project called the Glencliff Urban Village, which would consist of 22 micro homes for the homeless. 19 of the homes would be 200 square feet each, and 3 would be 400 square feet. In December 2016, the church's senior pastor and its head trustee sent a letter to the Metro Zoning Administrator requesting a reasonable accommodation pursuant to the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, which we know as RLUIPA. And this was to use the property in this manner. The accommodation sought would have relieved the project from complying with the regular requirements for property zoned RS10. The church partnered with Open Table Nashville along with other homeless and affordable housing advocacy organizations to develop this project. Upon receiving a letter from the church, the zoning administrator of the Metropolitan Government of Nashville and Davidson County issued a letter on January the 17th of 2017 granting the church's request for an accommodation pursuant to RLUIPA and the Tennessee Religious Freedom Restoration Act. That's Tennessee Code Annotated Section 4-1-407. It was issued on the basis that providing transitional housing is one method of serving the church's religious mission. This decision permitted the church to use a portion of its property for transitional housing in the form of code-compliant microhomes. Mike Freeman, a member of the Metropolitan Council, appealed the zoning administrator's decision to the Metropolitan Board of Zoning Appeals. It was argued that the nonprofit agency Open Table Nashville was leasing the space from the church and therefore was not protected under the RLUIPA Act since it was not a function of the church. However, the BZA voted 5-2 in support of the zoning administrator's decision to allow it. Following this hearing, Del Ward and 14 other citizens sued the Metro Government of Nashville and Davidson County in Chancery Court, which after affirming the BZA's ruling was then appealed to the Tennessee Court of Appeals. Appellants argued that the development should have been subject to the zoning laws and procedures because the development would be constructed, owned, and operated by a lessee of the property that was not a religious institution or assembly or otherwise exercising religion, and consequently, applying the zoning laws to the development would not adversely affect the church's exercise of religion. The appellants also argued that the project did not meet the standards for the accommodations set by the state and federal laws. The trial court upheld the decision by the BZA, and as did the Tennessee Court of Appeals. This now sets the standard in the state of Tennessee for religious organizations and their affiliated organizations to be granted a special accommodation to utilize tiny homes as a rent-free option for housing homeless individuals. So now that we've talked about the different kinds and styles of tiny homes and how people around the country are using them, what about Cheryl's she shed? She sheds and other outbuildings have become popular as backyard office spaces, art studios, craft rooms, workshops, hair salons, and entertaining spaces, just to name a few. Mostly considered accessory buildings, many now blur the lines between what is just a workspace and what is bordering on a secondary living space. For the most part, these can be a great addition to residential properties when there's enough room in the backyard. It really depends on how your zoning ordinances are written, whether or not the accessory use could be converted into a living quarters and then rented out as an apartment to non-family members, or whether their use alters the overall purpose of the zoning district in which they are located, such as a single-family residential neighborhood. This is an area where Planning Commission should be discussing these types of accessory uses to determine where they might make sense and where they might be an issue. We've talked about all the different kinds of tiny structures, their many different uses, but just how are these tiny dwellings defined by the law and permitted under zoning ordinances and building codes? To start with, tiny homes are not yet defined in the Tennessee Code. Because of the way they are constructed on trailers and mobile platforms, many would be classified as a recreational vehicle under most zoning ordinances. In fact, many are required to have such designation by the state to ensure that they are roadworthy and that in transport they are constructed in such a manner that shingles and siding and other materials stay affixed to the structure and are not blown off while traversing the highways. Here are two definitions from Tennessee Code for both fifth-wheel trailers and folding camper trailers. You'll notice that a fifth-wheel trailer is that which is defined to be a temporary living quarters, and it's of such size and weight as not to require a special highway movement permit, and is designed to be towed by another vehicle. Folding camper trailers are those which are mounted on wheels and constructed with collapsible partial sidewalls that fold for towing by another vehicle. Motorhomes are also defined in the Tennessee Code, and when you start to read through some of the things that define them, they start to see some similarities between these and tiny homes. A recreational vehicle, as is defined by Tennessee Code, means a vehicle which is either self-propelled or towed by a consumer-owned tow vehicle and designed to provide temporary living quarters for recreational, camping, or travel use that complies with all applicable federal vehicle regulations and does not require a special movement permit to legally use the highways. The examples they give are motorhomes, travel trailers, fifth-wheel travel trailers, and folding camper trailers. But as we've seen, some of the definitions for those start to blur the lines between what is a recreational vehicle and what is a tiny home. So what is the difference? That line is somewhat blurred as both could be used for temporary or permanent living. But does your local zoning ordinance or building code differentiate between one or the other? How does a tiny home differ from a single-wide manufactured home, you might ask? Well, in a lot of ways, Tennessee Code Annotated defines single-wide manufactured homes in a similar way to how tiny homes are constructed. That being that they are transportable in one or more sections. They could be 8 or more feet in body width, 40 feet or more in length, 320 square feet or more. They can be constructed on a permanent chassis. They can be designed to be used as a dwelling unit with or without a permanent foundation when connected to the required utilities. And they're not self-propelled or designed for travel upon public highways. But one important thing to note is single-wide manufactured homes in Tennessee do receive a special sticker that's placarded onto the side of the home itself. Some tiny homes that are manufactured also have a sticker, but they are different in the way that they are signed. A lot of your building inspectors will be looking for this specific sticker on the side to determine how the construction was and what use it actually falls under. The ICC International Residential Code defines mobile homes in almost the same manner as the Tennessee Code, but now the 2018 ICC Code defines a tiny house as a dwelling that is 400 square feet or less in floor area, excluding lofts. And in the latest code, there is no longer a minimum square footage requirement, which used to state it had to be at least 120 square feet. Definitions and legal jargon aside, what does it mean if we are not defining tiny homes separately in our local zoning ordinances and building codes? Well, let's take a look at what the 2012 ICC Residential Code establishes as the minimum for a residential structure. 120 square feet for one habitable room, 70 square feet for all other rooms, and at least 7 feet horizontal in any direction. It also requires at least a 7-foot ceiling height for 50% of the room if it's sloped to no less than 5 feet. There are also certain minimum restrictions for bathrooms, sleeping lofts, and kitchen areas. Essentially, this means that if you are not already defining tiny homes separately in your building codes or zoning ordinances, then they can be permitted almost anywhere a single-family residence may go, and down to as small of a structure as what is permitted by the ICC code. Whether or not that is considered a good thing will depend on your community. The 2018 Residential Code was updated to now include a specific section in the appendix for tiny homes, but it must specifically be adopted by ordinance when your local government adopts the 2018 code. Summarizing what that code says, you can still see some of the same restrictions for ceiling height, minimum square footage for rooms, but they did remove the 120 square foot minimum for the structure itself. So as a planning commission, you have decided you want to look into regulating tiny homes or confining them to certain zoning districts. Can you? Well, the answer is yes. Tennessee Code grants communities the power to regulate the location, height, number of stories, and size of buildings and other structures through zoning. It also allows you to specify the size of yards, required open spaces, density, maximum development potential of a lot, and the use of the property. So what are the recommendations? Well, the first would be to look at adopting an ICC housing code that has a specific section in it related to tiny homes. This not only assures that they are constructed to a minimum standard, but it also ensures that they're constructed in a safe manner that will protect occupants for many years to come. The other way is to look at setting minimum square footage for single-family homes in each of your residential zoning districts. For instance, you may have a single-family neighborhood where the average size of a home is 1,000 square feet. And while a tiny home could be a welcome addition, it may not always fit in certain neighborhoods. You could also need to look at defining single-family homes to differentiate them from 500 square foot apartments. You're probably wondering what the reasoning is behind that, but if you just simply say in your ordinance that you allow dwelling units to be as small as 500 square feet, you kind of open up the door to say, well, if you can have a 500 square foot apartment, why couldn't you have a 400 square foot or 500 square foot tiny home? Well, apartments are a little different. A lot of times you look at allowing those in upstairs of commercial buildings or in the rear of commercial buildings, so it's usually a secondary use and not the primary use of property. You might also want to consider foundational requirements for small homes that are built either on site or assembled elsewhere and delivered to the site. Much like you do with many manufactured homes, a lot are required to be set up on a permanent foundation and are skirted or have some sort of material around the bottom of the structure to make it look as though it is a regular home. Another thing to consider is requiring architectural or engineering drawings. This is just to ensure that the home was constructed in a proper manner, and it will also aid your building inspector in being able to look at how the unit was actually constructed itself. Finally, you can consider adding additional square footage requirements for either persons or sleeping areas within the residential structure, perhaps setting a minimum square footage based on the number of people that will be living in the tiny home. Planned unit developments are another good way to include tiny homes into your zoning ordinance. Some are known as pocket communities, and they can be similar in nature to RV parks and mobile home parks. This is where you have an allotted space size for each tiny home. You require certain open space areas, streets, and utilities to be supplied to each home site. From there, you can determine the minimum lot sizes or spaces for each of the tiny homes themselves. And you can regulate the use as cabins or cottages that can be rented by adopting a short-term rental properties ordinance. Also look at maintaining existing lot size minimums for single-family structures unless it's in a planned community. So the key takeaway, are tiny homes right for your community? And if so, where do you envision them? On a lot by themselves or maybe in a neighborhood of other tiny homes? A lot of questions you often get asked is, how will this affect property values and tax revenues for the community? Well, just like any residential home, these will be taxed, but maybe not to the same degree as a single-family home. You have to remember that's based on the assessment value of the property. So depending on the value of the tiny home and the property itself, you could look at smaller tax revenues from that piece of property. The other thing to consider is, to what standard should they be constructed, and what should the size minimums be? Would you go strictly off of what the International Building Code says, or would you adopt certain minimum sizes through your zoning ordinance? Another consideration is whether or not to require them on permanent foundations. Some of the pictures we saw earlier showed some on trailers, but do you really want to see those mounted on trailers in your community if it's outside of an RV park or something a little more permanent? So how will your community define them? That's something you should probably start discussing now. And you should consider taking action now, because it's hard to plan without a plan. So decide how you envision seeing tiny homes as being a part of your community and start talking about them at your planning commission meetings. And as always, the planning staff of the Southeast Tennessee Development District is here to assist you. We'll be glad to answer any questions you may have about them, and we're glad to look through your ordinance and see how you might be able to accommodate these new dwelling units into your local ordinances. If you have any questions, that is our contact information on the screen, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you, and have a great day.